In this slidecast, we'll talk about implementing the queue abstract data type. Now, using the standard list class, we'll use that as a container for our queue abstract data type. So we've seen throughout the semester that we can define kind of an abstraction for a new abstract data type, and we can implement that using the abstract data types that we already have implemented. So the standard library defines the queue as a template class, so it takes any of the sequential containers as a template parameter. And the sequential container list has the push back and pop front functions, and we'll use those to implement our queue ADT. So here is a file of the methods for our queue class. And the author places these, remember, in a listqueue.tc file, that TC for template class. And this is so he puts these implementations in a separate file from the header file, but this file is included in the header file because we can't compile this TC file directly because it references our type parameter for our template class. So this needs to be in the .h file, which is then included in the files where we actually declare queues of specific types. Here we see the operations for push, front, pop, empty, and size. So stop and look these over and see that you understand kind of the meaning of each function. Now the author includes this .tc file at the end of queue.h. It's included outside the class definition, but at the end of the file. And just like the stat class, queue is an adapter class because it adapts the functions from another class to the interface for queues. For example, a list is used as the container object, so the push function for queue corresponds to lists pushback. And the queue front operation corresponds to the list front. So when we have this adapter class, this process of taking a method in queue and relying on a method from the adapted class, that's called delegation. Now, insertion occurs at the rear of a queue and removals at the front. So we need a reference to the last list node so that insertions can be done in constant time, order 1. And the number of elements in the queue is changed by methods push and pop. So here are our 3 nodes that are part of the queue, and our queue object has a pointer to the front for removal, a pointer to the back for insertions, and a count of the number of items in the queue. Here's an outline of what's in our queue header file. We'll include node.h as sort of a nested structure or class. We have the private fields front of queue and back of queue. And then after our class definition, we include the linked queue.tc file. And that has the implementation of our queue methods. Here's our linked queue.tc file where we implement the methods for our queue class. So we've got push and front. We also have pop and empty and size methods. Stop and study these methods and be sure you understand what each method does. Another way we could implement a queue is using a circular array. Now, the efficiency of a single or double linked list to implement a queue is acceptable because we can do inserts and removal in constant time. There are some inefficiencies because to store the items in a linked list, we have to have space to store the pointers to the next item in the list. Now, we could conserve and save that space if we had an array implementation that just stores the items with no pointers, because the position in the array, kind of indicates what is the next and what is the prior element in the queue. Now, the problem with an array, or the potential problem, is that if we insert at the rear of an array, we can do that in constant time. But if we remove from the front of the array, and if we have to move every item to fill in that empty space, then it's a linear removal time. And if we remove from the rear of an array, that's constant. But then if we had to insert in the front, that again would be a linear operation because we'd have to move every item over one space to make room at the front. But there's another way that we can use an array and we can avoid these linear time operations. Let's see how we can do that with what's called a circular array. Now our array queue.tc is a queue class implemented using an array as kind of the container type. And it has 4 data members. We have a default capacity of 10, and then we have capacity, which is the size of our currently allocated array. We have num items, which is how many items are actually occur in the array. And then we'll keep a front index and a rear index. And then we have a pointer to the data member, the data, that'll point at this dynamically allocated array. And this should be similar to what you saw in the vector class earlier in the semester. Now the idea is that we'd have an array such as this that would have a capacity of 5, and if it's full with 5 items, we can have the front index point to the location 0 and the rear index points to 4. And now if we remove an item from the front, our number of items would go to 4, and we could simply increase the front index to 1. Now here's a case where our array is full and our rear index and our front index are next to each other. The rear index would be 0 and the front index would be 1. This is what would happen if we added an item to the queue from the last picture. Let's back up. Notice here the front index is 1. We've got available space here. So when we go to insert something at the rear, and if we're at the end, we'll simply wrap around. So the rear index could go to 0, and now we've got 5 items in our queue. So here's an example where we've got 3 items in the queue. We have a rear index here, the front index at 3. And now if we go ahead and add B to the queue, we would increment the rear index and insert B here at index 1 so that we would have 4 items in the queue. So now we've got 1 available space. So let's look at an example. Here we have an array with capacity 5. There's nothing in the queue. So our front index and our rear index are positioned as shown here. Here is our constructor for our queue. We have our capacity would be this default capacity, the num items 0, front index 0, the rear index set to point to the end, and we allocate a default capacity array. Now if we start out in this way, let's see what happens as we add items to our queue. So if we push a star, here is our push method, and we can follow the code to see what happens. We first check to see if we're at the capacity. Since we're not, we increment the number of items to be 1, add to the rear index, and we insert the item. So there goes our star. Now if our queue is full, in this case we have a capacity 5, what happens if we go to push D? In this case we'd check to see we are at capacity, so we call reallocate. What does a reallocate operation do? Here is our reallocate method. We compute a new capacity and we allocate an array of that size. So the new capacity is twice as big as our current capacity. We would create an array with 10 slots. We set the front index to be J, and then starting at J, an index into the old array, we copy every item in the current array to the first half of the new array. So as we go through here, you'll see we'll copy item by item. We need to keep them in the order that they appear in the current array. but we'll start filling right from the front. So now we've copied everything into our array. We set the front index to 0, which points to the first item in the queue. Our rear index points to the last item in the queue. Set our capacity. And then we call our swap operations so that our queue object now points to the new container, this new array. And we delete the old array to free up that memory that was allocated with an earlier call to new. Now we can go back to and resume our push method, and we increment the number of items and add, in this case, D to the end of our queue. And we adjust the rear index. Now by choosing a new capacity that's twice the current capacity, we amortize the reallocation cost, just as we did for vectors. And so we'll consider the insertion cost to be constant. Now here's our array queue implementation. Here's the push method that we were just looking at. And we notice that the rear index, as it gets incremented, will mod it by the capacity so that it wraps around when we get to the last index in an array. Okay, and this is our circular array. Here's our reallocate method that we were looking at earlier. So all three implementations of this queue abstract data type are constant time. And even though this reallocating is an order n operation, we don't do it that often. And if we amortize that cost over all of our insertions, it's constant. So both linked list implementations require more storage because there's extra space for the links. Now C++ stores a copy of the data for a queue element in each node in addition to the links. So a node in a single linked list has one pointer, a node in a double linked list has 2 pointers, and the node in the circular array just has the data. So a circular array that's full requires half the storage space of a single linked list, assuming that the data type requires the same amount of storage as a pointer. Now if the array is just allocated, though, half of the array would be empty, so in that case it's similar to the storage of a single linked list with data that's the size of a pointer. Now if the data items we're storing in the queue start to grow much, much larger than pointers, then our amount of overhead for pointers it becomes less and less. And that's the end of this slidecast.